Welcome back to another episode of Lucky from Within podcast. Within this particular episode, I want to talk about something that is so potent and something that if you can embody this one thing, it is going to make such a huge impact on your manifestations for 2025. So I'm really excited to delve into this particular topic. And this particular topic is navigating contrast and what contrast actually is when things feel like they are going wrong from the outside world, from your 3D perspective. So last week I spoke about making decisions from the 4D, making decisions from the quantum field and what that actually means, right? So if you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend. But this episode, I want to talk about contrast. So when things feel and look like they are going wrong, when in reality, if we can navigate this and we can actually come from the perspective of everything is actually working out for me, everything is actually rigged in my favor and actually working out in the highest timeline to give me exactly what I desire in the highest timeline, then your manifestations are going to come in with so much more ease. And I want to actually talk about this from the perspective of things that have actually happened in my own life as well. So this particular podcast, you might realize that I'm in a different environment, right? And I actually recorded this podcast at home where I usually record my podcast episodes. And when I finished recording the podcast episode, I realized that there was no sound. So I recorded it, it looked fabulous, and I was on fire with what I was saying. The downloads were dropping through. And then there was no sound at the end of the podcast when I played it back. And my immediate thought was, oh my goodness, how could this happen? And the old identity, so the old version of me would try to figure everything out, would try to figure, how can I get the sound back? How can I make this happen in a really forceful way, right? But instead, I decided to look at it from a different perspective. And I looked at it from the perspective of, okay, this is happening for me. There's a happening for a reason. And I'm just experiencing the contrast. I'm experiencing the law of polarity here. So the law of polarity states that, we can't have the sun without the moon. We can't have the light without the dark. We can't have the rain without the sun. There's always going to be the opposite of what we desire. So a lot of the time, when things go wrong and things aren't happening exactly in the way that you thought it would happen, when you desired the certain thing, when you created the vision board, things might look different than you had intended them to. Say you wanted to manifest more money and then you received a random bill in the mail and you're like, hang on a second. This is the opposite of what I desire, what is going on here. And a lot of people will actually drop the desire. They will drop the frequency in that moment and say, okay, it's not actually working. The universe is against me. This is why I don't believe in manifestations, blah, 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 blah. Haven't we all been there, right? But a lot of people drop their desire right there and then. And that is why I wanted to create this episode and talk about this, because it's actually not the truth. Your 3D reality is not the truth. And when we give it so much meaning, when we give what is happening in the 3D, and when I say 3D, what is happening in your current reality, what you are experiencing right now. And the 3D is what we can, sense with our eyes, we can touch, we can hear with the 5 senses. Whereas the 4D, the quantum realm, we can tap into at any time is actually the real world. That's how I like to explain it. It's the real world. Because how many times have we been in our imaginary state as kids and everyone's like, no, come back to the real world. No, I want you to stay in the real world. I want you to give the real world meaning rather than your current reality. Because your current reality is based on your past energy, your past vibration, your past thoughts, feelings, beliefs. But you're tapping into the lucky girl from within, which is a new vibration. And you can decide that you are her today. You can decide that you've tapped into that energy and that frequency. So going back to the story where why I'm in a different environment, why I'm actually in a podcast studio, which is absolutely gorgeous, by the way. Look at these chairs. I've got a camera, I've got recording, I've got this beautiful environment where I'm recording this because I decided to look at the contrast and the polarity differently. I decided to look at what happened when I recorded that podcast as a reason to shift, as a reason to book this podcast studio, as a reason to decide to make a decision from the version of me who is speaking to thousands of people through this platform, through this podcast, through this YouTube video, wherever you are listening to this episode. I decided to make the decision from her rather than my current circumstances. I decided to release the attachment to that particular podcast episode and actually release it and say, okay, that happened for a reason. Maybe it wasn't meant to, for one, be recorded in my lounge room, or for two, it wasn't meant to be recorded in the way that it was meant to be recorded. I was meant to talk about this particular experience on this podcast episode, right? Can you see how I have shifted from something going wrong and perceiving it as, oh, well, I'm just not meant to do that podcast, la-di-da-di-da, making up all these stories, giving meaning to my current circumstances. I decided to tap into the imaginary. I decided to tap into the 4D, the quantum realm, and make a decision to book out a podcast studio instead. And this is only one example. Another example is a property that my partner and I have decided to purchase a new property. And within that property, there were so many times within that process that we experienced contrast. There were so many times where our external reality was saying that there's no way that you are going to get this property. So many times. But instead of giving meaning to that reality, because as soon as you look at your circumstances and the contrast, you give it meaning. Say the money example, you give that bill meaning and you're like, okay, well, that means that I'm not going to attract the money that I desire this month. You drop your frequency. And then, of course, you don't attract the money that you desire because you've dropped the frequency. So instead, we decided to go back into the imagined state. We decided to look at the end result of that house already being ours. And instead of dropping the desire, we kept the desire no matter what was happening in our external reality. And we, surprise, surprise, got the property at the end. We manifested it because we decided to look at contrast differently. We decided to look at polarity differently. So the message from this particular episode today is that if you are experiencing contrast in your reality now, how can you tap back into the frequency of the desired reality? How can you tap back into her and move and act from her or him, they, and make decisions from the 4D, the quantum realm, where your desires are already yours? Because when you do that, you hold the frequency with your desires and boom, your whole reality shifts. So, a really potent short podcast episode, but jam-packed, because if you embody this one thing, everything is going to shift. I absolutely have no doubt about that. So, until next time, beautiful souls, remember that the lucky girl is always from within.